Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What if the night itself could steal your soul? It was a question that had haunted my thoughts for weeks, always lingering at the back of my mind like a shadow too close to touch. Every night, as darkness settled over the world, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something waiting. The air, heavy and thick, seemed to press in as though the world was holding its breath. I had learned long ago to ignore the things that didn't make sense. The strange sounds that whispered through the walls, the way shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't. But that night was different. That night, I couldn't escape the creeping sensation that I was being watched. I lived alone. A small house on the edge of town, far enough from the city to feel isolated but close enough to hear the distant hum of traffic. I liked it that way. The quiet. The stillness. It had become my refuge after everything had fallen apart. After the accident. After the loss. It was easier to be alone than to face the world. But sometimes, even in the safety of solitude, the silence becomes suffocating. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, like a soft rustling, as though something was moving just outside my window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a stray animal, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I stepped toward the window, my feet silent on the hardwood floor. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting, watching. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing but the empty street. Instead, there was a figure. A shape standing in the yard, motionless. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of a person, their body twisted in a way that seemed unnatural. My breath caught in my throat. My hand trembled as it gripped the fabric of the curtain. Was I imagining this? Then, as if sensing my presence, the figure turned slowly. The air seemed to grow colder, the night darker. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled the curtain shut, my heart racing. I backed away from the window, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and disbelief. It was just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself. Just a shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wrong. Something was out there. Watching. Waiting. The house felt different now. The silence was oppressive, and the air thick with tension. The walls seemed to close in, and the familiar comfort of my home suddenly felt like a prison. I turned off the light and lay down, pulling the covers over my head, hoping that sleep would come quickly, that the night would pass without incident. But it didn't. The sounds continued, soft rustling, faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. They grew louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if they were outside or inside my head. My pulse quickened. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then came the knock. A single, sharp rap on the door. I froze, my body stiff with fear. Who would be knocking at this hour? I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. A third knock, and then silence. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I couldn't bring myself to look. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there in the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The house was still. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low and soft, like a whisper through the walls. Help me. I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was familiar. I had heard it before. But from where? The room was still. Nothing had changed. Was that real? I whispered to the empty room. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't real. Or was it? The house had changed. The walls seemed closer now. The air was colder. I could feel it pressing in on me, as if something was waiting to reach out from the darkness and drag me under. I couldn't escape it. And that was when I realized something was here. And it wasn't going to let me go. I couldn't tell if my body was moving or if I was just floating, detached from the world around me. The room felt too small now, as if the walls were pressing in, closing off any escape. The whispers that had haunted the corners of my mind were now real, audible, and growing louder by the second. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears like a warning, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The voice, soft, fragile, still lingered in the air. Help me, it repeated, over and over, like a distant prayer. But who was it? Was it a trick? A hallucination? I had to be imagining it. But the fear gnawed at me, relentless, seeping into my bones. I glanced toward the door again, hesitating. The knocks, though faint, still rang in my ears. Someone was out there. Someone or something. I had to know who, or what, was waiting on the other side. The thought of opening the door terrified me. What if it wasn't just a person? What if something was out there, something I couldn't even begin to comprehend? I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow. The house was too quiet now, too still, but the silence felt wrong. It felt like the calm before a storm. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I slowly stepped toward the door. My mind screamed for me to stop, but my body moved as if on its own accord, each step heavier than the last. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, unsure if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. Before I could touch it, the door suddenly swung open. I jumped back, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. But there was nothing there. The yard outside was empty, shrouded in darkness, and the street light on the corner flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the ground. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring into the emptiness. Had I imagined it? Had the knock been just a figment of my panicked mind? My eyes darted across the yard, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the soft hum of the night. I shut the door quickly, almost too quickly, and locked it with shaking hands. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house felt safe again, or at least as safe as it could. But my mind wasn't at ease. The tension in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. A sudden movement outside caught my eye. I whipped my head toward the window, my chest tightening. There, in the darkness, was the figure again, standing at the edge of the yard. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and twisted. The shape of its body was wrong, distorting in ways that made no sense. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing and cold. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, but my legs felt like lead, unable to carry me anywhere. The air was suffocating, thick with dread, and every breath felt like it might be my last. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It glided across the yard with unnerving speed, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't walk, it slid, as if it were floating just above the ground. My blood ran cold as I watched it approach the house, the sound of its movement growing louder with each passing second. I scrambled for the phone on the nearby table, my fingers fumbling as I tried to dial. But the screen flickered and died in my hands. No signal. Of course. No way to reach anyone. No one would believe me anyway. The figure was now at the window, its face still obscured in shadow. It was close, too close. I could hear its breath, or was it mine? My pulse raced as it raised a hand, its fingers long and gnarled, tapping softly on the glass. Tap. 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 I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Help me, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It came from within the room. I spun around, my eyes wide in panic, searching for the source of the voice. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing colder, heavier. The whispers had turned into faint murmurs, voices overlapping, filling the room with a sense of claustrophobic despair. The floor beneath my feet groaned. The walls trembled. The very house felt alive, as if it was no longer a safe place, but something else, something that was feeding on my fear. Suddenly, the figure's face appeared at the window. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. The face was almost human, but twisted, warped in ways that made it unrecognizable. Its eyes were wide, hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in all light. The lips stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth too sharp, too many. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room fell silent. I was left in the darkness, my mind reeling, my body trembling. Was it gone? Was it real? Or was this just the beginning? I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, the night was no longer safe, and whatever was out there was coming for me. The only question now was, when? The silence was suffocating. I stood in the middle of the room, paralyzed, staring at the window where the figure had just been. My breathing was heavy, ragged, each inhalation feeling like a struggle against the weight of the air around me. The house felt colder now, colder than it ever had before. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, as if something was still in the room with me. But when I looked around, all I saw was the dark, familiar interior of my house. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. The whispers, soft, insistent, had returned. They crawled beneath my skin, whispering words I couldn't understand. They sounded like a chorus of voices, overlapping, as if coming from all directions. But each voice felt familiar, like a memory I couldn't place, a face I couldn't remember. They grew louder, more frantic, and my pulse quickened. They were getting closer, circling me, driving me to the edge of madness. I tried to shake my head, to clear my mind, but it was as if the whispers were lodged inside my brain, gnawing at my sanity. "Stop," I whispered aloud, but my voice trembled, cracking as the words left my mouth. I was talking to myself, trying to convince myself that none of this was real. But I knew it was. I knew something was out there, something ancient and terrifying. The floor beneath me creaked, pulling me back into the present. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, listening. It came again. A faint sound, like footsteps on the stairs. I could hear them clearly, each step echoing in the stillness of the house. Slow. Deliberate. But who could it be? I was alone. There was no one else here. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever it was getting nearer. I darted toward the living room, my feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. A weapon, anything. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, swinging it in the air like it would somehow protect me from whatever was coming. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. I could hear the slow, rhythmic tapping, almost like it was savoring the sound. And then, nothing. Silence again. I stood still, gripping the lamp with both hands, my entire body trembling. Was it gone? Was I imagining it? My eyes scanned the dark hallway, but I saw nothing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the sound of my own frantic breathing. But then, the air shifted. It became thicker, heavier, like the very atmosphere was suffocating me. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. My skin crawled with a chill that dug into my bones. It was here. It had to be. I dared to take a step forward, but as soon as my foot hit the floor, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open, slowly, as though pushed by an unseen hand. The darkness beyond the door seemed to stretch and twist, like something was waiting for me in the shadows. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was there again. But this time, it wasn't standing still. This time, it was moving, gliding toward me with unnatural grace. It was taller than before, its limbs unnervingly long and thin, twisting in ways that defied logic. The features of its face were still hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting for something, anything, from me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The lamp slipped from my hands, shattering on the floor as I backed away from the door. I turned and ran, not thinking, just moving, my body reacting on instinct. I reached the front door, but when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. No, locked. My mind screamed. The only exit, the only way out, was blocked. I frantically pulled at the handle, yanking it with all my strength, but it wouldn't open. Panic rose within me, and I turned to the window. Maybe I could break it. Maybe I could crawl out, escape into the night. But before I could reach the window, the floor groaned beneath me. It wasn't just the house settling, it was something more. Something alive. I froze in place, staring at the ground. The floorboards seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, trembling underfoot. The sound grew louder. The ground was shaking now, vibrating violently beneath me. I could hear a deep, guttural growl emanating from below, something that sounded like it was coming from the very foundations of the house. It's coming. A terrible realization washed over me. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was part of it. Part of whatever was hunting me. I turned back toward the door, desperate, but the figure was already standing there, right in front of me, blocking my only escape. Its face, twisted, jagged, emerged from the darkness. There was something grotesque about it, as if it were wearing the remnants of a human face, but warped and distorted, the features stretched beyond recognition. Its mouth split open in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of black, decaying teeth. Its eyes, those eyes, were hollow, empty, like the void itself. I could feel it in my bones. The fear, the suffocating dread. It wasn't just here to kill me. It was here to take everything. My soul, my memories, my very essence. I stepped back, my body betraying me, unable to move, unable to think. The figure's hand reached out toward me, its fingers long and skeletal. I could see the darkness swirling around it, like a void that would consume everything in its path. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but it wasn't from the figure. It was coming from inside my own mind. I realized then I wasn't alone in my head anymore. The darkness was spreading, crawling through my thoughts, my memories. It was inside me now. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred. I felt myself being pulled into the void, into the same darkness that had been following me, feeding off my fear. I was slipping, falling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the figure's smile and the eyes of someone I knew staring back at me, lost in the dark. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed irrelevant now. My body ached, my head throbbed as though someone had cracked it open. I tried to open my eyes, but the world around me was blurred, like I was looking through water. Slowly, I became aware of the cold. Not the kind of cold that happens when the air is chilly, but the kind that sinks deep into your bones and never leaves. It was the kind of cold that felt unnatural, as if it had been there longer than I had. The air was thick with the smell of decay, something that stung my throat and made me gag. I could taste it, like rust, like something rotting. I tried to breathe in, but the air felt too heavy. It was suffocating. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. I forced my eyes open, and for a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. But then the reality of where I was hit me like a punch to the stomach. I was lying on the floor, my back pressed against the cold, uneven surface. The walls around me seemed to pulse with a sickly glow, the shadows deepening into shapes that shouldn't have been there. The room, or whatever this place was, wasn't familiar. It didn't look like my house. It felt alien, like I had been transported to a different world entirely. The air was thick, almost liquid, and every sound felt muffled, as though the very walls were swallowing it. I struggled to push myself up, my body shaking with the effort. My hands scraped against the rough floor, and I glanced around, desperately trying to find some sense of familiarity. But nothing looked right. The walls were cracked, the plaster peeling away like skin, revealing dark, jagged stone beneath. The light that flickered overhead was dim, casting long, sickly shadows that twisted unnaturally. There was no window, no door. Only darkness, stretching out in all directions. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had happened. What was this place? How had I gotten here? Was it real? Or was I still trapped in some kind of nightmare? The whispers had returned. I could hear them, faint at first, then growing louder. They were coming from all around me, from the shadows, from the very walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, urgent, pleading, was unmistakable. It was as if something was trying to reach me, trying to make me understand. I tried to move, to find a way out, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the very ground had become a part of me. Every step was harder than the last. My vision began to blur again, the shadows around me swirling, growing more pronounced. The walls seemed to close in, and for a moment, I thought I was going to suffocate right there on the floor. My breath came in short, panic bursts, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to find a way out. Then, I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor, slow and deliberate. A soft, grating noise, like nails on a chalkboard. My body froze. I knew what it was. It was that thing. The thing that had been hunting me, watching me, waiting for me. The figure. The darkness. It was here. I turned toward the sound, my eyes wide with terror, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in the far corner of the room, just beyond the flickering light, its form barely visible in the shadows. It was watching me again, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were studying me. Its face was still hidden, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me from all sides. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed. The whispers were louder now, their voices overlapping, growing frantic, but I couldn't understand them. I was trapped. There was no escape. The figure began to move, its limbs stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. It was slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring every step it took toward me. The shadows around it seemed to shift, to curl and twist as if they were alive. It was like the darkness itself had become its ally, a part of its form. The walls seemed to breathe with it, pulsing with each movement as though they were alive too. My heart hammered in my chest, but I still couldn't move. I was frozen, my body refusing to react. The figure was getting closer, its distorted form growing more and more grotesque with every step. The closer it came, the more I could feel its presence pressing against me, a weight I couldn't escape. Then, without warning, it lunged. I don't know how I moved, but suddenly I was on the floor again, scrambling to get away. My hands scraped against the rough stone beneath me, but I couldn't push myself fast enough. The thing was right behind me, its cold breath brushing against my neck, its long fingers reaching for me. I could feel its touch, cold and clammy, like death itself. I had to get away. I had to escape. I crawled across the floor, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me, blocking out everything else. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to move. I had to keep moving. I turned a corner and found a door, an actual door, this time. Desperation surged through me. I grabbed the handle, twisting it with all my strength, and to my surprise, it opened. I stumbled through, not bothering to look behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the horrible whispers, the cold air, the figure. For a moment, there was only silence. I leaned against the door, my whole body trembling. Was it over? Was I safe? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I knew was that I was still alive. For now. But the question still lingered in my mind. How long would that last? The silence was almost worse than the chaos. I pressed my back against the door, my chest rising and falling with each strained breath. The darkness around me was thick, oppressive, and I could feel it creeping in. It felt alive, as though the very air around me was a part of something much bigger, much darker. I wanted to believe I was safe, that I had somehow outrun the nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It never was. I slowly slid to the floor, my legs too weak to support me any longer. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to steady the shaking that had taken over my body. My mind was a fog of confusion and fear, everything blurring together into an incoherent mess. What had happened? What was that thing? And why was it after me? I closed my eyes, trying to block out the suffocating darkness, but the images came flooding back. The figure, the darkness that had been closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been toying with me, like I was nothing more than a helpless insect caught in its web. And the whispers, they were still there, in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Was I losing my mind? I didn't know how long I sat there, huddled in the corner of whatever strange room I had stumbled into. It felt like hours, but the longer I stayed in that eerie quiet, the more I began to doubt the reality of everything. Was any of this real? Or had I finally broken? The world outside seemed distant, unreal, as though I was no longer a part of it. The air around me felt different now. It wasn't just cold, it was thick, almost like I was breathing through wet cloth. I shuddered at the thought, but the weight in my chest wouldn't allow me to move, wouldn't let me escape the oppressive sense of being trapped in something far beyond my understanding. A sound broke the stillness. At first, it was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, an unmistakable sound of something moving, something shifting in the dark. My heart leaped in my chest, my body tensing instinctively. I wasn't alone. I could feel it again, that presence, closing in, like a shadow in the corner of my vision, just out of reach but always there, always waiting. I stood up, slowly, my legs still weak beneath me. The room, if it could even be called that, felt like it was closing in on me. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows stretching unnaturally, warping around me. Every direction seemed wrong. Every corner seemed to hold something lurking, something just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I turned, trying to keep my focus, trying to keep my wits about me. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, the darkness seemed to deepen even further, gathering in a twisted shape that made my stomach churn. It was a doorway, but not one I had noticed before. It wasn't normal. The edges of the doorway seemed to distort, bending like liquid, flowing in unnatural patterns, as though it wasn't truly part of this place at all. It was wrong. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to touch it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side of that doorway held the key to everything. If I was going to get out of this nightmare, if I was going to survive, I had to find a way through. Every step I took toward the doorway felt like a battle. My feet felt like they were dragging, my limbs heavy, as though the very floor beneath me was trying to pull me back, to keep me in this suffocating, twisted reality. The whispers grew louder again, and for a moment, I thought I could make out words. Words that didn't make sense, words that felt alien. But they were there, clawing at my sanity, making it harder to focus, harder to think straight. I had to push them aside. I had to concentrate on the door. When I reached it, I hesitated. The doorway pulsed, the edges rippling in time with the beat of my own heart. I could feel the pull of something dark on the other side. It called to me in a way that terrified me, and yet I couldn't turn away. I had to know. I stepped through. The world on the other side was nothing like what I had imagined. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, like I was walking on wet earth. The dim light around me flickered, casting long shadows that stretched and writhed in strange patterns. It was as though I had stepped into another dimension, a place that didn't follow the same rules as the world I had known. The silence here was deafening. It wasn't the quiet of peace, though. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel unnatural. Like I was intruding on something ancient, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I took a tentative step forward, then another, each footfall echoing in the stillness. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A shape. A figure. It was small at first, just a dark silhouette against the mist, but it grew larger, more defined with each passing second. It was human-shaped, but something about it didn't seem quite right. The way it moved, fluid, unnatural, sent a chill down my spine. My legs froze. I couldn't move. My body was screaming at me to turn around, to run, but my feet wouldn't listen. I couldn't look away from it. The figure began to approach. The more it drew near, the more I realized that it wasn't just a shadow, it was something else. Something twisted. Something that didn't belong. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a grotesque mask of shifting features, all eyes and jagged lines, constantly shifting, constantly changing. It was a face that seemed to have no form, no identity, just a mass of horror. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like they were warning me, like they were begging me to turn back. But it was too late. The figure reached out with long, skeletal hands, its fingers bending in unnatural ways, stretching toward me like they were meant to wrap around my throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My chest tightened as the figure's hand brushed against my skin, ice cold and burning at the same time. And then everything went black. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone when you knew, without a doubt, that no one else was there? I've been living in an old manor for the past few months. It's a place heavy with history, worn down by time but strangely beautiful. The walls are thick, the floors creak underfoot, and the air always carries that scent of something musty, of old wood, dust, and forgotten stories. Most people would call it a dream home, but to me, it felt more like a tomb. I had moved here to escape, to find peace and isolation after everything. My life had been a series of small traumas, a string of events I had tried to put behind me, but they kept creeping up, like shadows that never fully disappeared. I thought maybe a change of scenery could fix it, that time and space would heal the cracks in my mind. But when I stepped into the manor, I should have known it was never about the place. It was the silence that got to me first. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. No, this was a deep, almost suffocating quiet, the kind that presses against your eardrums, making you feel as though the walls themselves are closing in. I would sit in the parlor for hours, the only sound being the occasional ticking of the grandfather clock, the creak of the floorboards as if something or someone was walking just beyond my reach. And then, one night, I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint sound, like a whisper coming from deep within the walls. I thought I was imagining it, that perhaps it was just the house settling or the wind moving through the cracks. But as the days passed, it grew louder. At times, I could almost make out words, though they were so soft, so elusive, that I couldn't quite understand them. It was like something was speaking just beyond my hearing, deliberately out of reach, like a voice pulling me toward it without me even realizing. I tried to ignore it at first. It was probably nothing, right? Maybe just the odd acoustics of an old house. But as the whispers continued, they began to shift, becoming more personal. More directed. "You've never been enough," the voice came again, clearer this time, though still faint, like it was rising from the very foundation beneath my feet. I froze. I felt my heart tighten in my chest, like the words were too familiar, like they were spoken by a voice I should have recognized, yet couldn't quite place. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. I shook my head, trying to shake off the panic creeping up my spine. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen, could I? I ran my fingers over the back of the chair, a sudden urge to move, to get out of the room. But the silence was heavier now, pressing down on me. I almost thought I could feel it wrapping around my neck. I left the parlor, retreating to the safety of my bedroom. It was better in there. The thick walls of the manor provided a sense of security, a distance from whatever was lurking outside. But even as I lay in bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me, the voice followed. "You can't escape it." I shot up from the bed, my breath shallow, my chest tight. The voice was closer now, so close I could almost feel it, like it was inside my own mind. But the room was empty. The manor was silent again, save for the faint hum of the old heating system. I was losing my mind. That's what I kept telling myself. It was just my nerves. The isolation. The pressure of living in a place so ancient, so full of memories and ghosts. But then again, wasn't it strange how the voice never quite stopped? It was as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to listen, to respond. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. It was inescapable. The next day, the whispers had turned into something else. They weren't just words anymore, they were questions, taunts. Questions about things I had buried deep in my mind. About things I thought no one knew. About things I had told no one. Why did you leave her? My breath hitched in my throat. My fingers trembled, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as I stared at the wall, the voice seeming to crawl across the surface, as though the very paint was speaking. I could feel my stomach twist. My throat constricted, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. The walls felt alive with it, alive with something malevolent that fed on my fear, on my guilt. I had to confront it. I had to find the source of the voice, the source of this growing madness. I spent the rest of the day wandering the manor, touching walls, pacing, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But the house seemed unchanged. No secret rooms, no hidden passages. Just endless hallways and doors that led to more rooms, more empty spaces. And still, the voice continued. Soft at first, then growing louder as the night stretched on. "Why did you leave her, Nathan?" I stopped. My name. It wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't just in the walls. It was in me. It was a thought I couldn't escape, a question I couldn't answer. For the first time, I felt its presence. The house wasn't just haunted by echoes of the past. It was alive, somehow. And it was speaking directly to me. I had no choice but to face it. The voice wasn't going to let me hide. The next few days bled into each other, a blur of confusion, guilt, and strange urgency. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of her, the woman I had left behind. That memory. That mistake. But it wasn't just the guilt that kept me awake. It was the voice. It was there even when I wasn't listening, lurking beneath the surface of my thoughts. "She's gone because of you." It was almost too familiar now, the way it coiled around my thoughts, like it was reading my mind and twisting it just enough to make me question everything I knew about myself. Was it me? Had I really done that? I tried to focus on the mundane things, making tea, reading, cleaning, but no matter what I did, the voice would slip in, a low murmur beneath the surface. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to confront it, or at least try to understand what was happening. What was this thing that had attached itself to me? Was it the house? Was it my mind? Or was I simply unraveling under the weight of the past? I spent hours in the library that afternoon, poring over old journals and letters that had been left behind by previous owners. The manor had a history, I knew that much. But what if it wasn't just the house that was haunted? What if something else had seeped into the walls, into the air, into me? I sifted through the dust-covered papers, trying to make sense of it all. The further back I went, the more I found references to strange occurrences, to people who had come and gone, people who had vanished without a trace. And then, there were the mentions of a particular name, Evelyn. Evelyn. The name hit me like a punch in the stomach. I flipped through the pages, desperate to find some connection to what was happening to me. There were letters, written in shaky hands, pleading for help, warning the future inhabitants of the manor. But it wasn't the warnings that stood out to me, it was the consistent mention of Evelyn. She had lived in the house decades ago. She had been connected to something. But what? She didn't leave. The voice whispered again. You made her disappear. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing through the silent house. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. What did it mean? I thought about the woman who had left me, Evelyn. No, it wasn't possible. This couldn't be about her. The guilt, the whispers, everything felt like they were blending into one. I turned my attention to the walls, feeling the pressure building behind my eyes. The manor felt different now. It wasn't just the old creaks or the wind howling outside, it was something deeper, something malevolent. As I walked through the grand hallway, I noticed something I hadn't before. There, in the dim light, a door I had never seen before. It was tucked in the far corner, hidden beneath a thick layer of dust. It hadn't been there the day before, or had it? I walked toward it, my breath shallow. Something about this door felt wrong. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold brass handle. It creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. I hesitated. Why hadn't I noticed this before? The thought gnawed at me. But the voice, it called to me, urged me on. Go down. You'll find the truth. I stepped forward, my pulse quickening as I descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent of decay seemed to follow me like it was wrapping itself around me. The walls were damp, and the silence was so deep it felt suffocating. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to press in on me, thick with an unseen presence. The walls themselves seemed to close in, as if trying to hold me in place, as if they were alive. And then, just as I reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, my breath quick and shallow. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't see, couldn't move. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, the voice returned. You shouldn't have come. The voice wasn't in my head anymore, it was right here, in the room with me. I could feel it, like a presence, thick and oppressive. I reached out blindly, feeling the walls, the cold stone, my fingers brushing over something soft. A piece of cloth? I pulled at it, my heart racing, but as I did, a faint light flickered to life in the corner of the room. A single candle, flickering weakly, casting long shadows against the walls. And that's when I saw it. A figure, hunched over, its back to me. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could feel its eyes on me. The room grew colder, and I could hear the soft breathing, the quiet sobs of someone who had been lost for far too long. You should have never left. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I knew this voice. I recognized it from the walls, from the whispers that had haunted me. Evelyn? I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. The figure didn't move. But the sobbing, it grew louder, more frantic, as if it were right beside me, breathing down my neck. And then, from the darkness, I heard something else. A rustling, like cloth being torn, followed by a low, guttural laugh. The door at the top of the stairs slammed open again. The laughter echoed through the room. And the voice, the silent voice, finally spoke clearly, as though it had been waiting for me to understand. You never left her. She's always been with you. I couldn't move. My heart thundered in my chest as I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the figure in the corner. The dim light from the flickering candle cast twisted shadows, and the laughter, the sickening, twisted laughter, echoed in my skull like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. Evelyn's name hung in the air, unanswered, but the voice responded once again, thick with malice. You've always known she was here. The words sliced through my mind, cutting through the fog of confusion. Evelyn? What was happening? I knew the house had secrets. I knew there were things buried in the walls, hidden under layers of dust and time, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. The figure, hunched and silent, was no longer just a shadow in the corner of my mind. It was real, and it was waiting for me to understand. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, trying to keep the panic from overwhelming me. The sobbing continued, now more desperate, each breath filled with sorrow and pain. It sounded so human. Too human. The figure still didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge me. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I grasped the cold metal of the candle holder. I held it in my hand like a shield, but I knew it would do nothing. The air felt heavier with every second, suffocating. It was like the walls themselves were breathing with me, pressing in closer. Who are you? I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the sound of my racing heart. The figure's head jerked up, its face hidden in the darkness. For a moment, everything was still, too still. Then the sobbing ceased, replaced by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I am who you left behind, the voice murmured, so close now that it felt like it was inside my mind. You thought you could escape me, escape her. But you never left. I backed away slowly, the weight of its words pressing on me. Escape? I hadn't thought I was running from anything. I had left for a reason. A necessity. She had been gone for years. But now, standing in the darkness of the manor's bowels, I realized just how much of her had stayed with me, buried under my skin, wrapped in my thoughts. A nightmare I couldn't escape. The figure shifted again, and this time it turned toward me. I could see her, or at least, I thought I could. There were flashes of something human, something familiar, but something else, something wrong, beneath the surface. Her face was twisted, gaunt, as if pulled too tightly by invisible strings. Evelyn. But it wasn't Evelyn. The eyes, once so full of life, were now empty, like hollow sockets, staring through me. You left me in the dark, she whispered. You let me die alone. I stumbled backward, a wave of nausea sweeping over me. My head spun as the room seemed to close in tighter. I wanted to scream, but the words were trapped in my throat. The voice, Evelyn's voice, now crawled through the air, tightening its grip on my mind. You left her to die. I shook my head, trying to push away the darkness pressing in from all sides. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I'd buried that part of my life. I had to. I couldn't face the truth, not the truth of what had really happened, what I had really done. But the voice, it knew everything. I didn't mean to. I gasped, my throat tightening with the weight of the words I had kept buried for so long. It wasn't my fault. The figure's head tilted to the side, her skeletal features stretching unnaturally. She was grinning now, a grin that split her face too wide, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. The grin didn't reach her hollow eyes, though. Her gaze remained vacant, like she was staring through me into something far beyond this world. You couldn't save her, the voice sang softly, sweetly. You never could. And now you can't escape me. I clutched the candle tighter, my hands slick with sweat. I have to get out of here. I turned, desperate to flee, but the door, the one I had come through, was gone. The stairway was swallowed in shadow, the way back impossible. I pounded on the walls, but the stone was cold and unyielding, echoing with the sound of my panic. There is no escape. I spun around, facing the figure once more. She was closer now, much closer, standing just a few feet away. Her breath was warm against my skin, an icy chill creeping through my body. And then, the candle flickered, dying in an instant. The darkness was absolute. I could hear her now, feel her presence pressing against me, invading every thought. She wasn't just a figure in the corner anymore. She was with me. She was inside my head, in my thoughts, in my soul. You never left her. The words rang in my mind, relentless, and with them, memories I had buried deep began to resurface. The fight. The harsh words. The pain. The silence. Her face, pale and empty, her eyes hollowed by the darkness I had forced her into. But then the voice wasn't Evelyn's anymore. It was something else, something deeper. Something ancient. You are mine now. The words wrapped around my brain like chains, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I fell to my knees, unable to breathe, to think. The shadows pressed in on me, the walls warping, shifting, the sound of Evelyn's sobbing echoing louder, until it was deafening, until the walls themselves were crying. You will never escape. I closed my eyes, clinging to the faint hope that this was all just a nightmare. But when I opened them again, the shadows hadn't gone. The figure stood over me, now a part of me, her whisper in my ear. You're still here with me, aren't you? I couldn't answer. The truth was too overwhelming. The truth was, I never left her. And she never left me. I couldn't feel the floor beneath me. It was as if my body had become weightless, floating in the suffocating void of the room. The darkness wrapped around me like a thick blanket, choking out every hint of light, every trace of reality. The only thing that existed was the suffocating presence of her, pressing down on me with an intensity one couldn't escape. Her voice, now more than just a whisper, curled around my thoughts, entwining itself with the fabric of my consciousness. I couldn't tell if I was hearing it aloud or inside my head. It didn't matter. It was everywhere. Always. I never left you, she cooed softly, and for the first time, her voice sounded almost affectionate, seductive in its familiarity. I've always been here, hiding in the walls, in the very air you breathe. Don't you feel it? Her laughter echoed again, a sound that twisted through my bones, making my heart pound faster. I could see nothing, but I could feel her, her presence so overwhelming that it made my skin crawl, my breath shallow. You tried to run from me, she continued, her voice soothing, like a lullaby. But you can never escape what's inside you. I closed my eyes tightly, shaking my head. I had to wake up. This couldn't be real. But with every heartbeat, I could feel the walls closing in, the air thickening. The memory of the manor's cold stone walls, the damp, musty smell, seeped into my mind. It was real. I was still there. But how? How was this possible? I tried to stand, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the weight of my guilt and fear had grown into something tangible, pressing down on me, making it impossible to move. I opened my eyes, searching desperately for something, anything, that could explain this. The room was empty except for the darkness. But the darkness felt alive, pulsating with a life of its own. "It's not too late," she whispered, and suddenly a chill ran through me. "I know what you did. I know what you hid." Her voice was sharp now, almost accusatory, but it was still hers. Still familiar. Still haunting. The walls felt as though they were closing in tighter around me, the air becoming thicker with every breath I took. My throat tightened, and I couldn't speak. My body felt numb, like I was being pulled into the earth itself. "You can't run anymore," the voice whispered again. "You never could." A memory surfaced, unbidden, a memory of Evelyn's face, pale and empty, the way she had looked the night everything had changed. The way her eyes had looked at me, accusing, knowing. I never meant for it to happen, I thought to myself, but I knew deep down that the voice was right. I had run. I had left her behind, and now it seemed like she was returning, bringing with her everything I had tried to forget. The figure in the corner of the room remained still, but I felt her presence growing stronger, filling the air with an energy I couldn't understand. It was like the very walls were pulsing with her words, her pain. I could feel the space around me shifting, stretching, becoming something unfamiliar. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, warping into shapes that didn't quite make sense, shapes that seemed to stare back at me with knowing eyes. "You thought you could forget," the voice purred, now playful, as if mocking my feeble attempts to escape. But it was never a matter of forgetting. It was always a matter of remembering. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my thoughts to push away the suffocating presence that surrounded me. But it wasn't working. The walls were closing in. The shadows were growing longer, taller, and with them, the feeling of being watched. Of being hunted. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I heard a sound. A soft, scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. The sound grew louder, closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I opened my eyes again, desperate for a glimpse of the source. But there was nothing. Just the shifting shadows and the oppressive silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "I know what you're thinking," the voice said, and this time it was no longer comforting. It was sharp, laced with venom. "You think you can make it stop. You think you can get away. But you can't, not from me. You never could." I took a step back, my legs shaking, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. And then, in the deepest corner of the room, something moved. Something shifted. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, some illusion brought on by the pressure of the dark. But then it moved again, closer this time, and I saw it. The figure, now clearly visible, was hunched over, its face twisted in the flickering shadows, mouth wide in a grotesque grin. The candlelight flickered once more, and the shadows stretched impossibly long, creeping across the walls, twisting into unnatural shapes. "It's too late for you," the voice said, and this time it wasn't Evelyn's voice anymore. It was something darker. something older. I've been waiting for you. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer with each movement. I could see its face now. No, not her face, just a dark, empty space where its features should have been. A face that wasn't a face at all. Just void. I've always been here, inside you, the voice rasped. You thought you could escape? You thought you could bury it all? I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my lungs burning as I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The darkness was alive now, pressing in from all sides, crushing me. The walls were no longer just stone, they were breathing. And with every breath, they pulled me deeper into the void. The figure stepped closer, its feet dragging across the floor, and I could feel its presence now, cold and suffocating. It was closing in. And I could do nothing but watch, helpless, as the shadows closed around me. You never left me, the voice whispered. And you never will. The world collapsed into darkness. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, smothering, as though the very atmosphere was refusing to allow me the release of oxygen. My chest tightened, the panic clawing at my throat, but there was no escape. Not anymore. The figure, it stood inches from me, and I could feel its coldness seeping into my skin, wrapping itself around my very bones. But then, the sound stopped. The scraping noise, the dragging feet, the eerie whispering, everything fell into a suffocating silence. For a split second, I thought I was free, that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had ended. I opened my eyes. The darkness was still there, consuming everything around me, but now it was alive, not just a passive void. The shadows writhed, shifting like living things, curling in on themselves and twisting in unnatural ways. I could feel their tendrils brushing against my skin, cold and clammy, their touch far too real for my fragile mind to comprehend. And then, in the distance, I heard it again. That voice, her voice, soft at first, like a breeze through an open window. You thought I would go away, didn't you? The words felt like ice scraping down my spine. You thought I would just vanish. I staggered backward, my legs trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. Every inch of space was shrinking. And yet, I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop myself from listening to the voice that had become my prison. You can't escape me, it whispered, now laced with a venomous sweetness. I'm inside of you. Always have been. Always will be. The figure, or whatever it was, remained unmoving in the corner of my vision, but I knew it was watching me. Its eyes, or rather, the empty sockets where eyes should have been, burned into me, though it hadn't moved. It didn't need to. The walls shifted again, and I felt the pressure build around me, a sense of suffocation that wasn't just physical but psychological. My mind was being crushed, each breath a battle. Each thought was drowned by the voice. Do you remember, John? She asked, her voice twisting the name in a way that was both familiar and foreign. Do you remember the moment you left me? The moment you turned away? My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands bracing against the cold, stone surface. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. My mind was a fog, a haze of confusion and fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It felt like my mind was unraveling, like I was losing all sense of who I was, who I had been before this nightmare started. Do you remember Evelyn? The voice was like a dagger now, cutting through the fog. She was everything to you, wasn't she? You wanted to protect her. You promised you would. But you failed her, didn't you, John? My head snapped up. Evelyn's name. My heart clenched, and a deep, gnawing guilt began to claw at my insides. The memory hit me like a tidal wave. Evelyn, pale and lifeless, her eyes empty of life, of everything I thought I could protect. I couldn't escape it. It all rushed back in an instant, the moments before her death, the lies I had told myself, the way I had walked away, leaving her behind to fend for herself. The guilt gnawed at my soul, and now it was returning to tear me apart. You left her, John, the voice continued, growing more insistent, the words stabbing into me like daggers. You didn't stay. You didn't fight. I gasped, shaking uncontrollably. The room spun. The walls pressed tighter, closer. I could feel them on top of me, closing in, closing me off from everything but this voice. I waited for you, it whispered softly, as though it were a secret shared between us, the breath hot against my ear. I waited for you to remember, to come back to me. But you didn't. You left me here, alone. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I could taste the bitter salt on my lips. I wanted to escape. I needed to escape. But there was no escape from her. Not from this. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. No, it plummeted. My breath became visible, white clouds of fog forming in front of my face. It felt as though the very air around me was freezing, solidifying with a cold that crept into my bones. The figure in the corner moved, or rather, it shifted. It didn't walk or take a step, it simply became closer with each blink of my eyes. Each time I looked away and back again, it had moved a little nearer. But still, it didn't need to walk. It simply was. It was suffocating me, and there was no way to escape. You'll never be free, the voice rasped. I'm here, John. You brought me back. And then, the room shifted. The walls faded, distorting into an impossible angle. I couldn't tell where the ground ended and the air began. It was as if reality itself was falling apart. The darkness swallowed me whole, the presence of the figure growing overwhelming until I could feel it in my very skin. The walls no longer felt like walls. They felt like they were pressing against me, folding inward with every breath I took, until all I could do was inhale the suffocating shadows. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just the walls that were closing in on me. It was her. She had never left. She was everywhere. And now, so was I. The silence that followed was deafening. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a reflection didn't show you what you expected? What if, instead of your face staring back at you, you saw something darker, something hidden? That was the question that gnawed at me when I first laid eyes on the old mirror. I had been searching through my late grandmother's house for something useful, something to sell, something that would help me deal with the mounting bills. The house, abandoned for years now, was as silent and dark as the secrets it held. The floors creaked under my feet as I moved from room to room, each one more empty than the last. Dust covered every surface, but that was nothing new. It felt like the house had always been this way, untouched, frozen in time. It was in the attic where I found it, a large, ornate mirror with a tarnished gold frame. The glass was clouded with age, and at first, I thought it was just another relic of my grandmother's eccentric tastes. But something about it called to me. The mirror was heavy, its weight far beyond what I expected for such an object. The frame, though faded, still held intricate carvings of flowers and strange symbols, so old that they seemed almost unfamiliar. As I wiped the dust off the surface, the reflection that greeted me wasn't quite right. At first, it was just me, my face, my worn-out clothes, the tired eyes that had seen too much in the last few months, but then, something shifted. A dark figure appeared behind me, just over my shoulder. I blinked, shaking my head, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just the same reflection, my own face staring back at me. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a fleeting moment of exhaustion. But deep down, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't stop myself from looking back, staring into that glass. That was when I saw it again, only this time, it wasn't just a shadow. A face. It wasn't my face. It wasn't even human, not entirely. There was something about it, something wrong. The features were too distorted, as if something had been pressed into the reflection, forcing the image to bend and twist. But what truly made my skin crawl was the smile, the eyes that followed me as I moved, as though it could see me, not just my reflection. I stepped back, my heart racing. What had I just seen? I forced my eyes to look away, but it was no use. The mirror seemed to pull me back, as if something inside it was reaching out, beckoning me to come closer. I could hear my grandmother's voice, distant but sharp, echoing in my mind, "Never trust the things you see in the mirror, child. They're not always real." I had always thought she was just being superstitious. She'd often said strange things like that, things I didn't understand. But now, standing in front of the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I didn't know what it was, but the reflection, it felt alive. The figure in the glass seemed to mock me, its smile growing wider, its eyes darker, the longer I looked. It was like a part of me was slipping into that other world behind the glass, disappearing piece by piece. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling, unsure if I was imagining things. My fingers brushed against the surface, and for a moment, I thought I felt something, a cold, damp sensation that sent a shock through my body. Then the glass seemed to shudder. I yanked my hand away, heart pounding in my chest, eyes wide with disbelief. The image in the mirror had changed again. No longer was there just a shadowy figure. Now, the reflection was of someone else, someone who wasn't me. A woman. She stood behind me, her face pale and twisted with a look of anguish. Her hands were pressed against the glass, her fingers splayed out as if she were trapped, trying to reach me. Her eyes were wide, pleading, but there was something else, something darker in them, something that made my blood run cold. The voice came then, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me," it said. "Help me." I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes. The noise seemed to snap me out of the trance, and I took a sharp breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. My heart thudded in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through me. I was shaking, barely able to think straight. The woman in the mirror, was she real? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't understand. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't just leave this place, not now. Not when there was something in that mirror, something that wasn't me. But as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard a sound behind me. A faint, ragged breath, like someone was standing just at the edge of the room. A presence, cold and unnatural. I quickly glanced back at the mirror. The woman was gone, but the reflection of the room behind me remained. Only now, the floor was covered in blood. I froze. The room was the same as it had been moments before. The dusty floorboards, the old wooden beams, the clutter of forgotten objects. Nothing was out of place, except the mirror. I blinked and the blood on the floor was gone. But the feeling, that cold grip on my chest, remained. I couldn't shake the image of the woman, her face, her desperate hands pressed against the glass. The whispering voice still echoed in my mind. "Help me! Help me!" I stepped closer to the mirror again, my heart pounding in my ears. My reflection stared back at me, calm, composed, yet I felt like I was losing control. Something about the way my face looked in the glass, it wasn't right. There was a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, just beside my shoulder, but when I turned, there was nothing. I felt dizzy. The house seemed to be closing in on me, the walls creaking and shifting like they were alive. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to breathe, but I couldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my eyes glued to the mirror. That reflection, why couldn't I look away? I knew I should. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind once more. Never trust the things you see in the mirror, child. They're not always real. The glass before me rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped back, but the movement in the mirror didn't stop. The woman's face reappeared, but this time her features were even more distorted. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to follow me wherever I moved. Her mouth twisted into an unsettling grin, and then, without warning, she whispered again. "Come closer." I recoiled. I didn't know if I could trust my own senses anymore. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the handle. But before I could turn it, something strange happened. The reflection in the mirror started to shift. The room behind me in the glass didn't match what was in front of me. It was different. The walls were darker, the air heavier. It was a space I didn't recognize. I spun around, my breath shallow. The room had returned to its normal state, but something about it felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, longer. The floor creaked unnaturally under my feet. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse quickening. This wasn't possible. As I looked over at the attic door, I saw something else. A figure, standing in the doorway, just at the edge of my vision. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I turned toward the figure, but when I looked, there was no one there. Just the empty doorway, bathed in the dim light of the attic. But then the whispers returned. Soft at first, like a faint breeze rustling through the trees. "Help me." I stumbled back, my legs shaking. My thoughts were a blur. What was happening to me? What was this mirror doing to my mind? I could feel my sanity slipping. I knew I had to get out of there, but the idea of leaving that attic without answers made my skin crawl. The door was close. I had to reach it. But as I stepped forward, the air around me grew colder, denser. It was as if the very atmosphere was pressing against me, holding me in place. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. The mirror seemed to pull me back. Its surface began to shimmer again, as though it were alive. I could see the reflection of my own face, but the eyes that stared back at me weren't mine. The face in the glass twisted, contorted into something grotesque. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore. With a final burst of panic, I ran toward the door, throwing it open, not daring to look back. The whispering voice faded behind me, but the fear lingered in my bones. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the overgrown lawn, gasping for air, the night wrapping around me like a shroud. My heart still pounded in my chest. The house loomed behind me, silent and foreboding, but I couldn't make myself go back inside. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing thoughts. What had just happened? What was that thing in the mirror? And why did it feel like I had been pulled into something darker, something far more sinister than I could ever have imagined? I glanced back at the house. The attic window, where the mirror had been, was dark. I couldn't see anything inside, but I could feel it. There was something watching me from that window. Something waiting. As the wind picked up, I turned away, knowing deep down that I wouldn't be able to escape the pull of the mirror. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a blur of confusion. I couldn't bring myself to return to the attic, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror either. Each time I closed my eyes, the reflection of that twisted face, the woman's pleading gaze, haunted me. I could almost hear her whispering from the darkness, urging me to come back, to help her. But I knew better than to trust a voice that came from a place so far beyond the bounds of reason. I tried to carry on with my life as if nothing had happened. I told myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the stress from the isolation and the unsettling silence of the old house had gotten to me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I found myself walking aimlessly around the house. I had started to develop an unusual habit, almost a compulsion, to circle the place, checking each window, each creaking door, as though expecting something or someone to appear. And yet, every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but the growing darkness. That evening, I was standing by the old wooden staircase that led up to the attic when I heard it. A faint creak. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as it often did in the cold night air. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I turned, my pulse quickening. A figure moved in the hallway behind me. I froze. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the dark shape that loomed in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real? Was it the mirror's influence again, or was my mind truly beginning to betray me? I stepped forward cautiously, each movement heavy with fear. But as I neared the doorway, the figure vanished. There was nothing there but the same long, dark hallway. I stood motionless, heart hammering in my chest. My head spun. I had to face the truth. The mirror was not just playing tricks on me. It was changing me. The lines between reality and the nightmares I saw reflected in it were blurring. Every passing day, it felt as though the house itself had become an extension of my mind, twisted, distorted, and just as unpredictable as the images in the mirror. The next morning, I tried to avoid the attic, determined to leave it behind. But my curiosity gnawed at me, unrelenting. What was it that had triggered such a vivid hallucination? Was it the reflection of the woman in the mirror? Was there something or someone in that attic that was calling me? Unable to resist, I found myself back at the door, staring at the brass handle that had once been so familiar. I could feel the air growing colder around me. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves outside. I reached out for the handle, hesitating for a moment before I turned it. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the darkness. The air inside was thick with dust, the stale scent of abandonment hanging in the air like an oppressive weight. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room. The mirror was still there, its dark surface reflecting nothing but shadows. But it was different now. The moment my gaze landed on the mirror, I knew something had changed. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and I could feel the room shift around me. The walls, once sturdy and solid, seemed to undulate. The mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone thrown into a pond. Then, it happened again. The woman's face appeared, but this time, her eyes were wide with terror. She reached out toward me, her hands pressed against the glass. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I stepped closer, drawn to her, despite the overwhelming urge to turn and run. "Please." The voice, muffled but urgent, cut through the silence of the attic. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the mirror. As my fingers brushed the cold glass, the reflection shifted. The woman's face twisted, her features warping and distorting into something unrecognizable. I recoiled, stumbling back. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was alive. The glass seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if it were a living thing. The room around me dissolved into darkness. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the suffocating void. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, moving toward me, stretching, growing. I could see eyes, hundreds of eyes, peering at me from the darkness. Their gaze was cold, empty, full of something far worse than fear. In a panic, I turned and bolted for the door. The cold air of the hallway felt like a release, but I knew it wasn't over. The mirror's pull was too strong, its influence too pervasive. It wasn't just in the attic anymore. It was following me. I needed to get away, to escape this nightmare. But there was no escaping it. Not anymore. As I stumbled down the hallway, I glanced back. And there, just beyond the attic door, I saw it. The reflection of my own face, staring back at me. But it wasn't me anymore. It was the woman. The same woman from the mirror. Her expression twisted into something cruel, something malicious. And just before the door slammed shut, I heard her voice, clear and distinct this time, calling my name. Help me. I was no longer alone. The mirror had taken something from me. Something I couldn't get back. And now, it was coming for me. The house had never felt so alien. The moment I crossed into the hallway, I felt its oppressive weight pressing in on me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse in time with my erratic heartbeat. Every corner of the house held its own secrets, its own mysteries. But now, those mysteries felt like threats, like claws scratching at the edges of my mind, trying to pull me deeper into the void. I staggered back from the attic, my breath shallow and panicked. The reflection of the woman's face, twisted with malice, haunted me. The echo of her voice, so cold and distant, still rang in my ears. Help me. But I didn't know how. I didn't even understand what was happening anymore. I had to get away. I had to escape, but where would I go? The mirror's reach had already begun to invade every part of the house. It had started with the attic, but now I could feel it everywhere. The mirror was not just an object, it was a presence, a force that stretched beyond the glass. I tried to convince myself that I could leave, that I could lock the attic door and forget about it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The mirror had found its way into my mind. I stood in the center of the hallway, staring at the dark staircase that led to the second floor. I could still feel the pull of the attic door behind me, beckoning me back into that dark, oppressive space. My feet felt like lead, unwilling to move forward, as though some invisible force was holding me in place. I looked around, half expecting the woman to appear again. Her eyes, they haunted me. The house was eerily quiet. Not a single sound broke the thick silence. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A small creak in the floorboards snapped me out of my thoughts, and I turned toward the sound. But there was nothing. I felt my throat tighten as the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I was not alone. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the hallway, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. When I turned, there was nothing there, but I could feel the eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I knew that whatever was in this house wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here. And it was getting closer. I turned and hurried toward the living room, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the old space would offer some semblance of safety. But as I entered the room, I froze. The mirror. It was there. Sitting on the mantel, as though it had always been there, as though it had never left the attic. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to acknowledge its presence. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The glass was smooth, reflecting the dim light of the room. At first, I saw nothing but my own reflection. But as my gaze lingered, I saw it again, her. The woman. She was standing just behind me in the reflection, her hands outstretched, her face filled with anguish. Her lips moved, but this time I heard her words clearly. "You cannot escape." The words felt like a physical blow. My breath hitched, and my heart began to race. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. There was nothing behind me. Nothing at all. I spun back to the mirror, but the woman's face had changed again. Her eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling as if someone was pulling her back into the darkness of the glass. I reached out without thinking. My fingers grazed the cool surface of the mirror, and the moment they made contact, the room seemed to warp. The walls bent and twisted, and the air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very foundation of the house was crumbling. And then, I felt it. A cold hand gripped my wrist. My body froze, and I couldn't bring myself to scream. My pulse hammered in my ears as the grip tightened. I tried to pull away, but the hand didn't budge. It felt as though something from within the mirror was pulling me in. I could feel its fingers, icy and relentless, sinking deeper into my skin. I yanked my arm back, but it was no use. The grip held fast. Desperation surged through me, and I slammed my palm against the mirror. The glass shuddered as though it had been struck by an unseen force. But it didn't break. Instead, a dark figure emerged from the depths of the reflection. A shape, twisted and indistinct, but unmistakably there. The woman's face, now contorted with pain, was the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor of the living room, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The mirror was back on the mantel, undisturbed. But everything felt different now. The house felt smaller, more suffocating. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And the silence was no longer peaceful, it was alive, pressing on me from all sides. I had never felt so completely trapped. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak. My head spun. I couldn't stop shaking. And then, through the haze of my panic, I heard it. The faintest whisper. Help me. I jerked my head toward the sound, but again, there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty, oppressive room. But I knew that the voice was real. That the mirror was calling me back. I had no choice. I had to go back. There was something in the attic. Something alive inside the mirror. And it was calling to me. The door was locked, but I didn't care. With trembling hands, I turned the knob and forced it open. The air inside the attic was heavy, stagnant. As I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, the cold seeping into my bones. The mirror stood there in the corner, gleaming in the low light like an ancient artifact, its surface smooth, almost inviting. But I knew better now. I wasn't in control anymore. The mirror had already begun to change me. And whatever was inside it wasn't going to let me go. Not until it had what it wanted. And it had already started with my mind. The shadows in the room seemed to stir, twisting into shapes that weren't there before. I backed away, my body trembling as I felt the familiar weight of something unseen in the room with me. The woman's face returned in the reflection, but this time she was no longer alone. I wasn't sure who or what was standing behind her. But whatever it was coming for me. And this time, I wasn't sure I could escape. I stood frozen in the attic, my breath shallow, my heart pounding against my chest. The mirror gleamed in front of me, an impenetrable surface that seemed to hold an endless void. The woman's face twisted in agony within the reflection, but this time I noticed something terrifying, a shape behind her, too large to ignore. It was standing there, just out of focus, just behind her. The figure was tall, its outline vague and indistinct, yet somehow unmistakably wrong. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, a mass of dark tendrils that stretched and writhed like an unnatural extension of the mirror's frame. Its presence was suffocating, its very existence a violation of everything I knew to be real. I staggered back, my body tense with fear. My legs were unsteady, my hands trembling, but I couldn't look away from the reflection. The figure seemed to be watching me, waiting. It was no longer just the woman that sought my attention, it was the darkness behind her that pulled at my consciousness, drawing me in. What is it? My mind screamed, trying to make sense of the impossible. The figure's shape was ever shifting, like a blackened mist that refused to hold a solid form. Every time I blinked, its outline changed, but it was always there, looming, watching, hungry. The woman's voice cut through the tension in my mind, fragile and desperate. You must listen, before it's too late. I wanted to shout, to ask her what it was that I needed to do, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence that followed her voice was deafening. The air was thick, as if time itself had stopped. Suddenly, a harsh whisper echoed around the room, a cold voice that sent ice down my spine. Come closer. The words weren't spoken aloud. They crawled inside my head, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I resisted the urge to move toward the mirror, but it felt impossible. My body was betraying me, urging me forward, urging me to step into that reflection. But I fought against it. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't ready to face whatever was in that mirror. I had to get out. I had to leave. I backed away, my steps quick and frantic, my breath erratic. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound. A soft scraping noise, coming from the direction of the attic window. At first, it was faint, like a rodent clawing at the walls, but the sound grew louder, sharper. It was unmistakable now. Someone was moving in the attic, following me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the space, but there was nothing there. The attic was still, cold, and silent, but the sense of being watched was unbearable. The scratching sound persisted, growing more urgent, more desperate. It was coming closer. I couldn't stay here any longer. Without thinking, I bolted toward the attic door. My hands fumbled with the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if someone, was blocking my way, preventing me from escaping. Panic surged through me. I jerked the handle again, harder this time, but it remained locked. The sound behind me was getting closer, closer, like something was crawling on all fours, moving in the darkness with unnatural speed. I need to get out. I need to get out now. I kicked the door with all the strength I had left, but nothing happened. The lock didn't give. My chest was tight with terror, my mind spinning in every direction, but I couldn't think clearly. The air felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. And then, the mirror, the reflection, shifted. I turned, instinctively, against my will. The woman was gone, but the figure, it was there. It was stepping out of the mirror now, not in the way a person would, but as if the reflection itself was bleeding into reality. The surface of the mirror rippled, distorting like water disturbed by a stone, and the figure pushed forward, its form coiling like smoke, reaching toward me. No, no, no. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the wooden floor. My eyes were locked on the creature, but I couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about its presence, something alive about it. The shadows around me twisted and writhed as if they were extensions of it, spiraling out to envelope the entire room. I reached behind me for the door handle, my hands slick with sweat, but the door still wouldn't open. The figure, the thing, was closer now, and I could hear it. I could hear its breathing, ragged and uneven, as though it was struggling to maintain its form. I could feel its presence in the very air, thick and suffocating. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. My mind screamed, but the creature's form was undeniable. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and flesh. The darkness that surrounded it seemed to cling to the air itself, distorting everything it touched. It opened its mouth. No words came out, but the feeling, the pull, was inescapable. The creature's gaze locked with mine, its eyes hollow, black, infinite. There was nothing behind them, nothing except the empty void of the mirror. I couldn't breathe. The room was closing in on me. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The cold of its presence was unbearable, as if the very temperature of the room had dropped to freezing. I had never felt so utterly helpless. I needed to escape. I needed to get out of here, now. With a desperate cry, I lunged at the attic door, slamming my shoulder into it. This time, it gave way. The door flew open, and I tumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran, my mind a blur of panic and terror. I could feel the weight of the darkness closing in on me, but I didn't stop. Not until I reached the front door. I yanked it open and stepped out into the night, breathing in the fresh air like it was the first breath I had taken in years. The house stood behind me, silent now. The mirror was gone. The figure was gone. But I could still feel its presence, lingering in the corners of my mind, a whisper I couldn't shake. I didn't know if what I had seen was real, but I knew it was something I couldn't forget. And as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was still out there, waiting. watching, calling me back. Have you ever felt like you're being watched? That strange, prickling sensation on the back of your neck that makes every step feel like you're walking through a minefield? I've been walking at night for years, but this night felt different. The light around me was faint, barely piercing through the thick shadows of the city, and the streets that usually felt like home now seemed foreign, as if the city had somehow shifted when I wasn't looking. The streetlights flickered every now and then, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched unnaturally across the pavement. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or maybe the tiredness from the long day. But something wasn't right. It was more than the faint hum of the city or the chill in the air. It was the feeling that there was someone or something behind me, watching. I turned a corner, the dim glow of the streetlights illuminating the cracked sidewalk in front of me. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, the sounds of cars and people distant, like they were a lifetime away. The buildings loomed over me, silent and cold, their windows dark and empty. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. Then I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. Just the long stretch of the street, lit by a few dying streetlights. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But as I kept walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was moving just out of my line of sight, staying in the shadows. I tried to focus on the sound of my footsteps, the rhythm of my own breathing, but it was becoming harder to ignore the noises around me. The occasional rustling of leaves. The distant screech of a car's brakes. The sound of my own pulse in my ears. But the sounds, they all seemed wrong. They were too loud, too close. Like the world around me was suddenly a little too alive, a little too aware of my every move. Why is it so quiet? I thought. There was always some noise in the city. Always. But tonight, it was different. I quickened my pace. My shoes slapped against the pavement a little harder now, and I tried to keep my focus straight ahead, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. That something was following me. I couldn't tell if it was my footsteps echoing back at me, or if someone was indeed trailing just behind. Then, I heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible shuffle, this time, closer. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. Closer. Like something was moving, slowly, deliberately, just behind me. I didn't dare turn around this time. I stood still, my heart racing in my chest, as the street seemed to grow colder, the air thicker, as if the darkness itself was pressing in on me. There was no one there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A shadow flickered in the corner of my eye, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. What the hell was that? I tried to shake it off. I had to be imagining things. But every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. The street that once felt familiar was now a maze of dark alleys and looming structures. The city had never felt this cold, this empty. As I walked faster, the sound of footsteps grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was there. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I sped up, they sped up. I broke into a run. My legs moved on their own, carrying me faster than I ever thought I could run. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I raced through the empty streets, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The darkness seemed to close in around me. The streetlights flickered and buzzed, casting a strobe-like effect across the city that made everything feel surreal, dreamlike. And then, a whisper. A voice, low and gravelly, like it was coming from the depths of the shadows. "Don't run." I froze. My blood ran cold. It was so close, yet I couldn't see anyone. The voice didn't come from the street. It didn't come from behind me. It came from everywhere. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. Was it someone? Or something else? Something more? I didn't wait to find out. I spun around and ran again, harder this time, not looking back, my mind racing as the sound of footsteps, so identical to mine, echoed around me. Was it real? Or had my mind finally snapped? The deeper I ran into the streets, the more the city seemed to close in on itself. The corners of the buildings began to blur, the streetlights flickering more violently. The darkness was swallowing everything, distorting my sense of direction, bending the familiar into something foreign and hostile. I had to find somewhere, anywhere, safe. But I couldn't escape the feeling. I couldn't escape it. The sound of my footsteps was now joined by something else. A low, guttural growl, like an animal, too close, too real. It was coming from behind me, from the darkness I couldn't see. I stopped again, breathless, my entire body stiff with fear. There, in the shadows, something moved. A shape, too large to be human, too unnatural to be anything I knew. Its outline was blurred, shifting, like it was made of darkness itself, stretching and pulling at the corners of the world. It was coming toward me. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt paralyzed. My legs wouldn't move. My breath was ragged. And the growl, it was getting closer. Then, the world around me seemed to tilt, as if everything was going out of focus. The shadows, the growl, the distant streetlights, all of it seemed to warp into a haze, like I was losing my grip on reality. Was I going insane? The creature's outline became clearer, its form stretching toward me, growing larger with every second. I could hear its breathing, ragged, heavy. It was almost like it was sniffing the air, trying to find me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The growling ceased. The streets were silent again. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The shape had vanished. But the feeling remained. And as I stood there, trembling, I couldn't shake the nagging thought. It's still out there. I stood frozen, my breath shallow and ragged. The world around me felt wrong, distorted. The streets that had been so familiar were now unrecognizable. The once welcoming hum of the city was muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. I couldn't tell if I had imagined the growling or if something had truly been there, lurking in the shadows. The fear in my chest gnawed at me, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something far darker than anything I had ever encountered. I forced myself to take a step, then another, moving slowly at first, as if the ground beneath me might give way. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. What was that thing? What was happening? The air felt heavier now, thick with the same tension I'd felt earlier, but amplified. The silence was suffocating, and the darkness seemed to swallow every corner of my vision. It felt as though the very city itself was shifting, bending, warping into something strange and hostile. I wanted to believe I had imagined it all, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows stretched longer, more exaggerated, as if they were waiting for something. Watching. I glanced back over my shoulder, but the street was empty. Just the usual night, empty buildings, flickering lights, the occasional rustle of wind moving through the trees. But there was something wrong about the way the shadows fell. It was like they were trying to reach out to me, pull me back into their depths. Stop. You're being paranoid, I told myself, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then, the sound came again. That soft, scraping shuffle. It was distant at first, just like before. But then it grew louder. Closer. Too close. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing. The street was empty, the only sound the faint rustle of a plastic bag caught in the wind. It was as if the world was playing tricks on me. I was imagining things. But the feeling didn't fade. It only grew stronger. I started walking faster, my shoes tapping against the concrete louder than before, but it didn't seem to matter. The sound followed me, matching my every step. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the echo of my own footsteps, but the rhythm was all wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Was I losing my mind? I could feel the tension in my muscles, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The further I went, the more the city seemed to close in around me. The streetlights seemed to flicker more erratically, casting shadows that danced and shifted unnaturally. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye, movement just at the edge of my vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing but darkness. And then it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just another person, a late-night wanderer like myself. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't human. The figure was too tall, too hunched, its movements too fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched taut across its thin frame. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark, hollow pits, void of any human warmth or life. The thing didn't even seem to blink. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body frozen in terror. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. My mouth went dry, and my heartbeat quickened. My legs felt like lead, my body refusing to move, as if it knew that even a single step could trigger something far worse. The silence between us was deafening, stretching for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the figure in front of me. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if its limbs were not meant to bend in that way. The shadow of its body seemed to stretch unnaturally long, distorting the air around it. It was like the darkness itself was feeding off of the creature's presence, twisting into something more sinister. "Don't move," I told myself. "Stay still. It can't see you if you don't move." But my body refused to obey. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward. My foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and I fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The creature didn't hesitate. It lunged forward, its hand, a long, bony appendage, claws extended, reaching toward me. I scrambled to get up, my hands shaking, my vision blurring with panic. I didn't know where to run. There was nowhere to hide. The city had become a labyrinth, its familiar streets now alien and hostile. The thing was closing in, its grotesque form moving faster than I could comprehend. No. No, no, no. My mind screamed for me to move, to get away. But I couldn't. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place as the creature's shadow stretched over me, blocking out the last remnants of light. Then, just as the creature's hand was inches away from my face, the sound stopped. The air around me grew still. Too still. I blinked, disoriented, and when I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone. In its place was only the empty street, the sound of my ragged breathing filling the silence. Was it real? My mind couldn't process it. The shadows still clung to the buildings around me, but the creature was no longer there. My heart pounded, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. Had I imagined it? Had the stress of the night finally gotten to me? I staggered to my feet, my legs weak beneath me. I looked around, but there was no sign of the creature. No sign of anything. The street was still empty, the city unchanged. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadows still felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, still watching. I couldn't bring myself to leave. The city, which had once felt like a comforting labyrinth, now felt like a trap. My every step seemed measured by an unseen presence. My heart hammered in my chest as I glanced up at the streetlights, which flickered as if they were about to fail. It's nothing, I told myself. It's just the fear, the adrenaline. But something inside me wasn't convinced. I began walking, my steps hesitant, unsure. The longer I stayed in the same spot, the more the shadows seemed to close in. The air felt thick, charged. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, its empty eyes boring into me. But nothing. The street was as empty as it had been moments ago. Still, the unease didn't fade. Instead, it grew, twisting into something darker and more insistent, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath. But my voice sounded hollow, as though the words had no weight. I kept moving, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my jacket, trying to ignore the lingering feeling of being watched. My footsteps echoed, too loud, too sharp. It was like the city had become a hollow shell, amplifying every sound, every movement. It was as if it was alive, waiting for something. A few blocks down, I passed the old convenience store I frequented. The flickering neon sign cast a sickly glow on the sidewalk, and as I walked past, I saw the reflection of the street in the store's window. Nothing unusual, just the usual nighttime stillness, the glow of lights spilling out into the darkness. But when I looked closer, I saw it. The shadow. It was in the reflection, right behind me. A dark, shifting shape that was too tall, too distorted. It wasn't mine. It couldn't be. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but the street was empty. There was nothing behind me. Nothing but the cold concrete, the occasional trash blowing in the wind. It's the dark playing tricks on you, I reasoned. You're just tired. You need to go home. I started to walk faster, the sensation of being pursued growing stronger with each step. I didn't look back again, though the pull to turn and see if something was following me was almost irresistible. My thoughts were a mess, spiraling out of control. I wasn't sure if I could trust my own mind anymore. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to take on a life of its own. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the city itself seemed to push back. Then, as I rounded the corner, something changed. The street that had been familiar, quiet and predictable, was now different. The buildings looked strangely distorted, as though they had shifted ever so slightly. The windows seemed to leer at me. The night felt too dark, the air too thick. I had walked down this very road countless times, yet tonight it felt alien. I stopped. In front of me, standing in the middle of the street, was a figure. A man. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a hat, the collar of his coat pulled high. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, as if he were posing. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, the chill that seemed to radiate from his presence. Something about him felt wrong. It wasn't just the darkness or the eerie stillness of the night, it was the way he stood there, unmoving, like he had been waiting for me. My chest tightened. What is this? I thought. Why is he standing there? I took a cautious step forward, my instincts screaming at me to turn and run, but my feet betrayed me, moving of their own accord. As I drew closer, the man didn't move. He didn't speak. "Hey," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" No response. I took another step, but this time the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, just slightly, like it was reacting to his presence. The streetlights flickered more intensely. I stopped again, a chill creeping up my spine. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and it seemed to echo, reverberating in my skull. "I've been waiting for you." My stomach dropped. The words, spoken with an eerie calmness, sent a wave of dread through me, and I stumbled back a few steps. "Who are you?" I forced out, but my voice was barely above a whisper. The man didn't move. His eyes, cold and hollow, shifted ever so slightly beneath the brim of his hat. I could feel them on me, burrowing into my skin. It's not safe anymore. The air thickened, pressing in on me. It was as though the world had narrowed, focused solely on this strange encounter. I wanted to run, to scream, but something held me in place, frozen by fear. The shadows seemed to grow longer around us, twisting and curling like they had a mind of their own. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, from those dark, empty pits where his eyes should have been. "Who are you?" I repeated, my voice a bit stronger this time, but the man only tilted his head, the motion too slow, too deliberate. "You know who I am. You've seen me before." My breath hitched. That's when it hit me, this wasn't the first time I'd felt this presence. His voice. The sense of being watched. I couldn't remember when or where I had encountered him, but I knew deep in my gut that this wasn't just some random stranger in the street. No, this man was part of something far darker, far older. What the hell was going on? Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care that I was running into the unknown, away from what I couldn't understand. I just needed to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I pushed myself, it felt like the world was getting smaller, closing in around me. The streets I had known my entire life were now twisting, changing, becoming wrong. And with every step, I could hear it. The sound of footsteps, keeping pace with mine. Not my own. It was coming for me. And this time, I wasn't sure I could escape. The streets blurred as I sprinted, the sound of my shoes slapping against the pavement a sharp contrast to the growing stillness around me. Every breath I took was ragged, harsh, but I couldn't stop. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, slowing me down, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to keep me in place. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the silhouette of the man standing at the end of the block. just standing there, motionless, watching me. But before I could fully register what I had seen, the darkness swallowed him up again, leaving only the empty, flickering streetlights in his place. Get a grip, I thought. You're losing it. You've got to keep going. But the panic in my chest wouldn't subside. Every corner I turned felt like I was only going deeper into the heart of something wrong. The city around me seemed to warp, its familiar buildings stretching and shrinking as though reality itself had become malleable. I had run these streets countless times, but tonight they felt foreign, like I was trapped in some nightmare, unable to wake up. I rounded another corner, my heart pounding in my ears. The street ahead looked different, darker, somehow. The houses, once warm and inviting, now looked like twisted silhouettes, their windows dark, like hollow eyes watching me from every direction. I couldn't tell if it was the darkness itself or something else that made them seem so menacing. I wasn't just running away from him. I was running from something else, something even more sinister. There was an oppressive weight in the air, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, the sounds of my panting loud in the eerie silence. The street was empty, the road stretching out before me like an endless void. My pulse throbbed in my throat, my legs trembling, but I couldn't just stand still. I had to keep moving. Then, just as I was about to turn the corner, I heard it. A faint whisper at first, barely audible. It seemed to be coming from the shadows themselves, from the very air around me. It's coming for you. I froze. The voice was distant but familiar, low and cold, like a voice from a dream or a nightmare. I turned quickly, my heart leaping in my chest. But there was no one there. The street was as empty as it had been moments ago. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. I'm hearing things. This is all just in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. I could feel it. It's real. It's happening. The whisper came again, louder this time, more distinct. You can't escape. I spun around, scanning the dark corners of the street. The shadows were alive, twisting and moving in ways that couldn't be explained. There was no wind, no breeze, yet the air seemed to shift, undulating with an unnatural rhythm. The world felt like it was bending around me, becoming something else entirely. I started walking faster, almost breaking into a run again, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My thoughts were jumbled, incoherent. What was going on? Who was doing this to me? The darkness felt like it was crawling toward me, like it had a mind of its own, wrapping around my body, suffocating me. I heard something behind me, footsteps. But this time, it was different. The rhythm wasn't the same. It wasn't matching mine. It was slower, heavy, almost deliberate. I dared another glance behind me, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just a man anymore. There was something else. Something far worse. The creature was there, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. Its form was tall and elongated, twisted, like it had been warped by something unnatural. Its skin was a sickly, grayish-white, its limbs too long, its fingers too thin, like they could reach out and tear through the very fabric of reality itself. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were wide, black holes, and they glowed faintly in the darkness, like they were sucking in all the light around them. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but I could feel its presence, felt it in the pit of my stomach, in the cold sweat that poured down my back. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something behind me, and I fell hard to the ground. The impact knocked the breath out of me, but I barely registered it. My gaze was locked on the creature, which was now inching closer. I couldn't look away. Its eyes, they weren't just watching me. They were studying me, measuring me. For a moment, I thought I heard the sound of something, laughing. But it wasn't human. It was low, guttural, and full of malice. The creature stopped, just out of reach, as if it were toying with me. Its limbs twitched, its body shifting in ways that weren't quite right, like it was still adjusting to the world around it. It was an abomination, something that didn't belong in this reality, in this world. What do you want from me? I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The fear had locked me in place. It took another slow step forward, and I finally managed to push myself to my feet. My body was shaking, but the urge to escape was stronger than ever. I had to get away from it. I had to run. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if they had been frozen, as if the world itself was keeping me in place. The creature took another step, its long, spindly fingers reaching for me. I could see the gleam of its claws in the dim light, and I knew that if it touched me, it would be the end. In that moment, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe I don't want to know what happens next. But that was too late. The creature lunged. And then, nothing. The world went black. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. All I knew was that I was no longer on the street, no longer trapped in that nightmare. My vision was blurry when I slowly regained consciousness. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp, metallic, like rust mixed with something else. Something wrong. I sat up quickly, my head pounding as if someone had struck me with a blunt object. My heart raced, and I placed a shaky hand on the cold, hard ground beneath me. It was wet. My fingers trembled, but I couldn't focus. I had to get up. I had to find a way out. But as I stood, a new sense of dread washed over me. The world around me was silent. Too silent. No streetlights, no distant cars, no rustling of leaves in the trees, just the sound of my breath, heavy in the air. It felt suffocating, the stillness closing in from all sides. I looked around, but everything was unfamiliar. The familiar streets I had been running through only moments ago? Gone. Replaced with nothing. The ground beneath me wasn't concrete or asphalt. It was soft, damp earth with scattered patches of moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The trees surrounding me were tall and twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Where am I? The thought flickered in my mind, but it didn't make sense. There was no reason I should be here. This wasn't part of the city. This wasn't part of anything I knew. The air had a strange, almost oppressive weight to it, like something was holding it all together, pressing in from every direction. My throat tightened, and I tried to swallow, but the dryness was unbearable. I took a few tentative steps forward, my legs unsteady, still not fully convinced that this wasn't another trick my mind was playing on me. But the ground felt real underfoot. I felt every stone, every uneven patch of earth, every patch of wet grass. This wasn't a dream. I stopped in my tracks when I heard it again, the whisper. It's not over. It's never over. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was distant but unmistakable. That voice. The one I had heard earlier, before everything went black. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper, It was almost like it was in my head, echoing through my thoughts, creeping into my very bones. I looked around desperately, my breathing shallow. There was no one there. No creature. No figure in the darkness. But somehow, I felt it. The presence. Like it was right there with me, just beyond my reach. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. But I knew that I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I turned around, trying to make sense of the twisted forest around me, but I couldn't see any clear path. The trees stretched on in every direction, their dark forms looming over me like silent sentinels. I took a deep breath, forcing my mind to focus. The panic was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, but I couldn't let it take over. Not again. I had to survive. With shaky steps, I began walking, hoping to find something, anything, that resembled a way out. But the deeper I went into the forest, the more I began to feel watched. The trees weren't just trees. The shadows between them were growing, bending, shifting. And the silence was overwhelming, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves, almost like footsteps, following me, but whenever I looked back, there was nothing. Then, I heard it. A soft, low sound, something that started as a distant hum and grew louder as it vibrated through the air. It was a rhythmic noise, something that felt almost mechanical. It was coming from deeper in the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't move. I could only stand there, my legs frozen, the sound filling the space around me, crawling under my skin. And then, I saw it. In the distance, a faint light flickered. It was small, barely visible through the thick trees, but it was there. A glowing, pulsing light that seemed to call to me. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore it. It was the only thing that made sense in this twisted, unrecognizable world. I moved toward it, each step tentative, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and run. But I didn't. I couldn't. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I began to hear the sounds more clearly, a rhythmic thumping. Like a heartbeat. A mechanical, unnatural heartbeat. It echoed around me, bouncing off the trees, filling my mind with dread. The light finally became clear enough for me to see the source, a small structure in the middle of the forest. It looked like a shack, but it was old. The walls were decaying, half-rotted, with rusted metal panels jutting out from the corners. The pulsing light was coming from a strange device attached to the side of the shack, a huge, metallic box with wires snaking out of it, pulsing in time with the thumping sound. I felt a strange compulsion to approach it. But as I stepped forward, something shifted in the air. A sharp, sudden coldness washed over me, and I realized, too late, that I wasn't alone. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, with its back hunched as if it had been waiting, just beyond my vision, for me to get too close. The creature from before. The one with the glowing eyes. It was here. It had found me. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered in my ear, but this time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature stepped closer, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned into my soul. And then, just before I could do anything, before I could even think, the world went black again. It's funny how sometimes the silence of the night feels more oppressive than the loudest screams. I had always loved the quiet, the peaceful stillness of midnight. But that night, the quiet was different. There was something in the air that made my skin crawl. It was just past midnight when I first heard it, a sound so soft, so subtle, that I wasn't sure if it was real. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the house settling with the temperature. But then, I heard it again. Breathing. It was slow, steady, almost imperceptible, but there. I had lived alone in this old, creaking house for years, and I knew every inch of it. But tonight, something felt off. I told myself it was nothing. The kind of rational thought I always clung to in moments of doubt. It's nothing. Probably just the house, or the wind, I whispered to myself. But there it was again, closer now. The house had always felt alive in its own way. Old houses do that, don't they? The creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the pipes, the sounds of the wind against the windows. I was used to it. I had learned to ignore it, to block it out. But tonight, everything felt wrong. I lay still in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to sleep. But the sound continued, breathing, like someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, waiting. The longer I listened, the more convinced I became that I wasn't alone. But I was. I knew I was. It's just my imagination, I repeated to myself. But the thought didn't comfort me. It made my heart beat faster, more erratic. The breathing stopped. I held my breath, waiting for it to return, for the next soft intake of air. But nothing came. The silence felt even thicker now, like it was closing in on me. It was suffocating. But then, just as I started to think I had imagined it, there was a soft rustling. And then another breath. Only this time, it wasn't just breathing. It was a whisper. A voice, faint but unmistakable. I'm here. I froze, unable to move. My chest tightened, and I could feel the cold sweat begin to bead on my skin. Was I hearing things? I tried to tell myself that I was. That this was just some trick of the mind. But the whisper was so real, so chilling, that I couldn't deny it. I slowly turned my head, hoping to see nothing. But of course, there was something. I could see it now, just at the edge of my vision, a shadow. Not a shadow from the furniture or the walls, but something more. It moved. I blinked, and the shadow vanished. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't really gone. I pushed myself up, my legs shaky as I stood. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in as if the house itself was shrinking. I told myself to breathe, to remain calm, but every instinct screamed at me to run. I stepped toward the door, every creak of the floor sending jolts of panic through my body. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, as though it was aware of me, watching me, waiting. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, a sudden sound from the hallway made me freeze. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. And unmistakable. I wasn't alone. I turned, slowly, expecting to see nothing. But there, just beyond the dim light of my room, was a figure. A tall, dark shape standing in the doorway. I couldn't make out its face, only the faint outline of a form draped in shadow. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. But it hadn't vanished completely. No. It had moved, and it had left something behind. A chill in the air. A feeling of presence. I felt my legs weaken, my breath shallow as I backed away from the door. My mind raced, fighting the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. Was it real? Was it a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely? I couldn't tell. The whisper returned, this time louder, almost audible. I'm here. I've always been here. I bolted for the door, ignoring the panic that threatened to crush me. I swung it open and sprinted down the hallway, the dark rooms on either side staring at me like hungry eyes. The breath, the whisper, the shadow, they followed me. I reached the stairs and almost tripped as I descended into the pitch-black basement. The light from the kitchen was only a faint glow, but it felt like safety, something I desperately needed. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I realized the door was closed. I hadn't shut it. And now, standing before me, in the corner of the kitchen, was the shadow again. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had form. It had substance. A figure. Tall, thin, its edges blurred, like smoke, like it was never fully here, never fully present. And then I heard it again. That voice. That whisper. I'm here. Don't leave. I tried to scream. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My body felt frozen, paralyzed with fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. And then, I realized something. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was here. I tried to take a step back, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. My chest constricted, and I gasped for air, but none came. The figure in the corner of the kitchen stood perfectly still, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. The whisper didn't stop. I'm here. The words were clearer now, but still, somehow distant. They echoed in my ears, vibrating in the space between us, like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands shook at my sides, and I fought the impulse to look away. I had to keep my eyes on it. Don't look away, I told myself, though every part of me screamed to run. But running was impossible. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me, paralyzed by something I couldn't see but could feel. A suffocating presence that crept into my lungs, filling me with dread, making the air heavier, colder. I blinked, and for a split second, the figure was gone. The kitchen was empty again, just the faint glow of the refrigerator light casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. I looked toward the door. The door was still shut. Still locked. But the whispering didn't stop. You can't leave. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I spun around, desperately searching for the source of the voice. There, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow again. It was now in the doorway of the hallway, slowly creeping toward me, its form bending and shifting like it was made of smoke or fog. It was close. Too close. What do you want? I managed to whisper through the panic that threatened to choke me. The shadow seemed to pause for a moment, as if considering my question. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite a voice, but a feeling, a presence, it responded. I want you to stay. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout and run and tear through the door, but my body wouldn't let me. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was everywhere, inside my mind, inside my bones, inside my thoughts. It had taken root, and I was its prisoner. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath misting in front of me, even though the heating had been running for hours. Don't panic, I thought. Think. There had to be a reason for this. A reason for the shadows. A reason for the voice. It had to be a nightmare. It had to be. This couldn't be real. But as I stood there in the center of the kitchen, a chilling thought occurred to me. What if it was real? I reached for the nearest object, a kitchen knife. My hand closed around the handle, the cold metal grounding me for just a moment. A weak attempt at defense. But I felt no safer holding it than I had without it. The shadow shifted again. It was closer now. I could almost feel the coldness from it, suffocating, freezing. "You're not real," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You're just a figment of my imagination." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved. Slowly, deliberately. It glided across the floor, its form elongating, twisting. It wasn't walking, it was floating, like it was being carried by an unseen wind. Closer. Closer. I didn't dare take my eyes off it. Every instinct in me screamed at me to run, to break through the door and never look back. But still, I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, forced to watch as the thing in the corner of my kitchen drew nearer. Then, with a sudden movement, it stopped. The whisper came again. "Stay with me." The words seemed to resonate in the very walls of the house, reverberating in my head. They weren't just spoken, they were felt. A deep, gnawing sensation that crawled under my skin, making my blood run cold. I had to get out. Finally, my body responded. My legs moved slowly, cautiously, and I backed away from the figure. I wasn't sure if it was following me or if I was just too scared to look away. But I kept going, step by step, until I reached the door. I reached for the handle. The door was locked. My heart dropped. How had I locked it? How had I even gotten inside? I turned the handle again, pulling at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. "No. No, no, no." The whisper grew louder, closer now, as though it was right behind me. "You can't leave." I turned around, hoping to see an empty kitchen, a house that was still mine. But the shadow was there again. Closer than before. It was only a few feet away, its shape now unmistakable, a dark, wraith-like figure, too tall, too thin, too wrong. I couldn't breathe. "Please, don't," I begged, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. Was it the shadow? Was it the house? Was it myself? But it didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward me. And then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged. Time stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything around me froze, like the world itself had decided to hold its breath. The shadow, the thing that wasn't quite human, lunged at me, but I couldn't move. My limbs felt like they were bound in invisible chains, my body locked in place by a fear that was so deep, so consuming, that it paralyzed me. It was so close now that I could feel the cold radiating from it. The air turned frigid, biting at my skin as if the very temperature was bending under its presence. I could no longer hear the world outside. There was only the pulse of my own heart hammering in my ears and the dreadful stillness of the room. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see what was coming, but I couldn't escape it. I felt a chill as something brushed against my face, cold fingers, if they could even be called that. The sensation was like ice against my skin, and for a second, I thought I could actually hear it breathing. A slow, shallow breath, rasping as if it came from something that had long since forgotten what it meant to be human. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the darkness, though I didn't expect an answer. There was only the cold, the breath, the shadow. Then it spoke again. You are mine. The words slithered into my mind, unsettling, alien. The voice wasn't just spoken. It settled in my brain, sinking deep into my consciousness, and I could feel it there, twisting, like something was carving its way into my very thoughts. It was everywhere. Stay with me, it whispered again, and the words felt almost like a command. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But the weight of the thing was too much. The fear was too much. I wasn't sure if I was standing or if I was floating. Everything seemed to blur together in a whirlwind of cold and shadow and dread. Please, just leave me alone, I thought. Please. But the shadow didn't leave. Instead, it moved closer. I could feel it then, the sensation of something sharp, something alive just inches from my skin. It was so close, so real, that I could almost taste the cold on my tongue. I wanted to back away. I needed to run, but there was no way out. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in, shifting and bending on themselves as if the house itself was becoming a prison. I could hear the wood groaning, creaking as though it were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like I was drowning in it. Then, the thing reached out. I felt a hand, or what might have been a hand, graze the back of my neck. It was like ice. Cold. So cold. It sent a shock down my spine, making me shiver uncontrollably. I gasped, stumbling forward. My legs gave out from beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. My breath was shallow, ragged, and every instinct in me screamed for me to move. To do something. I looked toward the door again. The door, it still wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was keeping me here, trapping me inside this nightmare. The shadow was no longer just a shadow. It was becoming something more. A form. A shape. Its edges were still unclear, but it was solidifying, like it was trying to become real, trying to step into this world, and out of the darkness where it had been hiding. You can't leave, it said again, this time louder, more demanding. And then, it was gone. The kitchen was silent again. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Was it gone? Was it just gone? Had I imagined it all? I didn't know. But the silence in the room wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. There was a heavy weight in the air, something pressing down on me, pulling in my chest, making it harder and harder to take each breath. I was trapped in a stillness that was worse than any sound. I shakily stood, my hands gripping the counter to steady myself. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was it a hallucination? A dream? Had I really seen it? Felt it? I turned back to the door. I needed to get out. I had to leave. I walked toward it, every step an effort, every movement like dragging myself through mud. The door. I reached for the handle, but then I froze. It was there. The shadow. The figure. Not in the corner of the room. Not across the kitchen. But right behind me. It was breathing again. That shallow, raspy breath. And then I felt it, just as cold and as close as before, a hand, or something like a hand, pressed against my back. And then the voice. You belong to me now. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was whisper back, my voice barely a whisper, barely a sound. "I won't stay." But the shadow didn't care. It didn't listen. Instead, it pulled me into the darkness. I was falling through the cold, the dark, and the suffocating silence. My thoughts raced, but they were all scattered, like pieces of a shattered mirror, each reflection twisting and distorting into something unrecognizable. The breath was still there. Close. Too close. It hovered over me, in my ear, sending chills down my spine. It was as if the air itself had become a part of the creature. It was pulling me, dragging me somewhere, but I couldn't tell where. My body fought against it, but the force was too much. My legs, my arms, they felt like they weren't mine anymore, heavy, useless. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. That was what I told myself. But with every breath I took, the darkness wrapped tighter around me, squeezing, smothering the very air I needed to breathe. I had to wake up. This had to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. I could feel it, the coldness that burned against my skin, the presence that didn't belong. The shadow, that thing, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was here. It was real. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. I tried to move, to break free from the cold grip of whatever it was, but my limbs were frozen, stiff, bound by an invisible force. The floor beneath me was gone, replaced by an emptiness that swallowed me whole. My heart pounded in my chest, the only sound in the stillness. The only sign that I was still alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I blinked. The darkness faded. The weight lifted from my chest, the pressure releasing its hold, leaving me gasping for air. I was back, but not where I had been. I stood, disoriented, in a place that felt wrong. It was familiar, but it shouldn't have been. I was standing in the hallway, in my own house, yet everything around me felt off. The walls were too close, too narrow, and the air was thick with a sense of unease that had not been there before. The shadows in the corners of the hallway stretched unnaturally long. They slithered across the walls, alive, moving like they were trying to escape the dim light that barely illuminated the space. The scent of decay hung in the air, faint but noticeable, as if the house itself was rotting from the inside out. I took a step forward. Another. And then I stopped. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the door. The one that led outside. I knew it. I could almost feel the air on the other side, the escape, the freedom. But the door, it was wrong. It was twisted, contorted, like it was being pulled in two directions at once. And there, just beside it, was the figure. The shadow. It stood motionless, watching me. Its outline was distorted, like it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Its edges flickered, as if it were on the verge of vanishing entirely. Yet, I could still feel its presence, could still hear its breath, a soft, rasping sound that clawed its way into my mind. The door, it wasn't the way out anymore. It was the way in. Into something darker. Into something I wasn't supposed to see. I took another step forward, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away from this place. But I couldn't. My feet were already moving on their own, as if the house itself was pulling me closer, forcing me toward whatever waited on the other side of that door. The shadow moved. It wasn't quick. It didn't lunge like I had expected. Instead, it shifted slowly, unnaturally, like a fluid that refused to follow the laws of nature. Its movements were smooth, like it was liquid, but there was an unnatural weight to it, an oppression that dragged on the air around it. I could see its eyes now, or, at least, where its eyes should have been. Two dark voids, endless and empty, sucking in all light and life, leaving nothing behind but darkness. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, only now it was inside my head. It wasn't just a sound. It was a thought. A command. "You belong here." My body responded without my consent. My legs shook, and my heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open. The cold, putrid air rushed in, flooding the hallway with a stench that made me gag, like the very essence of death had seeped through the cracks in the walls. I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the door. The shadow was still watching. I was getting closer now. The door was just an arm's length away. And that's when it hit me. The realization that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to open that door. But now, it was too late. The figure moved again, this time with purpose, and its voice came again, louder, stronger this time. "Stay with me forever." It wasn't a request. It was a promise. I reached for the door handle. And then, everything went dark. The darkness didn't just surround me, it consumed me. 1 second, I had been standing at the threshold, my hand on the door, and the next, I was in the blackest void I had ever known. I couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as though the air itself had turned to stone, thick and suffocating. But I could still feel it. I could feel the weight of the room pressing against me, an invisible force wrapping around my body like chains, holding me in place. I tried to scream, but my mouth felt sealed shut. My thoughts were a blur, scattered fragments of panic and disbelief. What was happening? Where was I? Was this real? And then, as if the very thought of being lost had given it permission, the voice came again. It was deeper this time, closer. "I told you, you belong here." The words echoed through my mind, reverberating with a cold finality that made my skin crawl. The breath was still there, that same steady, suffocating breath, but now it wasn't just in my ear. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the air, suffocating me from all directions. I felt my legs give way. I collapsed, my body hitting what I could only assume was the floor. The coldness seeped through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, but there was something else, too, a presence. It wasn't just a physical coldness. It was as if something within the very walls, the very air, was pressing on me, forcing me into submission. I need to move. I need to get out. The thought was a desperate whisper in my mind, but my body didn't respond. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, my hands trembling, but nothing more. I was trapped in this suffocating prison of shadow and silence, the world beyond it a distant memory. I didn't even know how much time had passed since I had opened the door. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Time didn't exist here. The shadows around me shifted. Not in the way shadows should. No, these were different. They moved, stretched, twisted, like liquid blackness that flowed through the air. They seemed to come alive, undulating around me, reaching for me with the slow, deliberate movements of something that knew what it was doing. I blinked and the darkness flickered, just for a split second. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. The figure. It was there again. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was close. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape, morphing into something too terrifying for the mind to grasp. It was massive, towering over me, its features indistinct but pulsing with a malice that I could feel in my very bones. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, but this time it was more than just a thought. It was a command, a cold and terrible force that cut through my mind, drowning out everything else. I am trapped. The realization settled in like a stone in my stomach. There was no way out. Not from this. Not from it. I couldn't think straight. My panic began to spiral out of control. I had to move. Had to fight. But my limbs were frozen, my body unwilling to obey. And then, just when I thought I would lose myself entirely to fear, I saw it. A faint light. At first, I thought it was just a hallucination, an illusion formed from the depths of my growing madness. But no! It was real. It flickered in the distance, small and fragile, like a candle struggling to stay alight in a storm. I pushed myself up, struggling against the invisible weight holding me down. My hands grasped the cold floor beneath me, nails scraping against the stone-like surface as I slowly dragged myself toward the light. It was the only thing that seemed real in this nightmare. As I crawled, the shadows seemed to press in closer, more tightly than before. Their movements were jerky, erratic, as though they were angry that I dared to move toward the light. The air grew thick with dread, the oppressive weight of the darkness pulling at my very soul, trying to keep me tethered to it. I reached out for the light, my fingers brushing against something warm, something solid. It was a door. I had no idea how it had appeared. It wasn't the door I had seen earlier, but it was there, standing in the darkness, offering a way out. A way back to the world I had known. I pushed against it with all the strength I could muster, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Sealed. "You cannot leave," the voice said, its tone now laced with a malevolent satisfaction. I slammed my shoulder into the door. Again. And again. My body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And then, with a final, desperate cry, the door flew open. I tumbled forward, my body crashing into the floor on the other side. I gasped for air, blinking against the sudden light that flooded my vision. I had made it. I was outside. I was free. But then, I looked up. The door was gone. Vanished. There was nothing behind me now, just a vast emptiness, stretching out into the distance. And standing in front of me, just beyond the edge of the light, was the figure. Its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at me, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for me all along. And it would never let me go. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.